So my name's Matt Grimes. I'm a senior lecturer in music industries and radio at Birmingham City University. I'm also the degree leader for the music industries pathway in the School of Media. So one of the questions I often get asked is about the course that I run, or the course that myself and my colleagues run, and what do we do or how do we teach students about the music industries, and what does the course entail? So very briefly, the idea is that music appears across all forms of media. So one of the things that we try and get our students to engage with is ideas of how does music and how does the media come together at certain touch points. And we try and develop a career for them in that they can draw on a number of media skills that they will develop on the course, along with a number of music industry skills that they will also develop on the course. The thing with music, as I say, is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So it's very important that our students understand that within media, there is a demand for people with skills where they understand how the music industries work. So we try and get them to think not so much about working for a record label like Sony or Universal, working for a big music company, though at the end of that, when they graduate, they can do that if they wish to. But what I try and encourage is ideas around entrepreneurship. So it's really this sense that they will find a place within the music industry's ecology, somewhere that they can use their skills to fit in, to dovetail with other media workers, music industry workers, and start developing niche products or services or ideas that feed into those much wider music industries. I think the traditional form of how we understand the music industries to work is, I wouldn't say it's gone, but it's changing. It's fragmenting on a daily basis. What worked well yesterday doesn't necessarily work today. So we try and keep our students up to date with some of those changes in the music industries and how that they might not only look and study those things, but try and find new and creative ways to move those things forward. So we try and think of them as being the next thinkers within the music industries, the people that are going to maybe take some ideas that are already there and develop them into something else, or to push it to the next level where they can then find that little place for themselves within the music industries, and then work with bigger companies perhaps in licensing their ideas or services, or working in collaboration. I think nowadays collaborative working seems to very much be the way forward. So we try and encourage them to be thinking workers, we try and encourage them to be entrepreneurial, be innovative, be creative, find new ways of moving the music industries forward through a number of the changes that we've recently seen. So one of the other things that people also ask me is about how does the music industry survive in an age of technology? Well, I would argue that the music industry has always embraced technology. It's always moved with technology. So if we go back to the early developments of the music industries, which isn't a particularly old industry, it's only through the process of industrialization in the 1920s that music became an industrial process, that it became an industry in itself. Okay, so we had things like recorded music. We've had advancements from the record, from the copper disc to the record. We've had advancements from records to cassettes. We've had advancements from cassettes to CDs, CDs to MP3s, MP3s now to streaming. So those technologies are always going to be evolving, always changing, and the music industry has had to stay either at least with it or do its best to stay ahead of those changes. And it hasn't always done that successfully. But I think the thing with the music industries is this ability to look at the technologies that are there and find ways that they can be utilised in a way that actually brings a positive benefit, not only to consumers, but also to producers and also to distributors. So when I was a younger person, I remember cassettes was the big thing. I didn't have much money. I used to listen to the radio. I used to religiously record things off the radio on cassette. And I would build up what we now know as mixtapes. I would borrow records off friends and record them onto a cassette player. At that time, the music industries ran a massive campaign saying that home taping was killing music. The music industry survived or is still here. That was followed certainly in the 90s with the idea that you could burn music onto CDs using a computer at home. And then there was this whole thing around piracy, and the music industries put out a big campaign saying the music, burning CDs or copying music is breaking the law and it's killing the music industry. The music industries are still here. And we've had similar things now with MP3s where they said, well, the sharing of files, the sharing of MP3s is going to kill the music industry. The the music industry is still here. So I think some of those discourses that the music industry use in trying to, dare I say, control the flow of money, the revenue streams within the music industry, are slightly archaic. So certainly with new technologies, we're presented with an idea that copyright seems to be the thing that is maintaining some control over those technologies. The music industry itself is a copyright industry. People make money from imposing copyright laws onto other people to gain a revenue stream. My argument in that is that I think one of the issues that the music industry faces with that is that the laws that they're being used or being enforced or implemented are actually a bit out of date. So where perhaps the music industries have been a little bit slow to pick up on ideas like MP3s, when they first started to evolve, and streaming services that started to evolve, their way of catching up with those was to start to impose a number of copyright laws that actually aren't really fit for purpose. So I think there's a discussion there that needs to take place between the music industries and the way that the law is adapted or enforced to make sure that the laws that they're using are current and up to date. I think taking individuals to court over downloading music doesn't actually do the music industries any favours, and it generally tends to paint them in a bit of a bad light by saying that they're using their power and influence to prosecute members of the public that would normally be good music industry consumers. So for example, I know lots of people that use downloaded music, or they download music or stream music as a gateway into discovering new music, and then they go out and buy the music legally. So there is an argument that actually these services can be seen to be beneficial to the music industry. I think one of the other problems here is that the music industries has had a tendency to say that if they don't get the money, if artists don't make money, artists will stop making music. I speak to a lot of artists, I do some consultancy work with musicians. My feeling on that is that actually they make such a small amount of money from things like digital downloads and streaming that actually I try and encourage them to think of their music not as being a revenue stream per se, and that they will sell music, but use it as a way of promoting their music and then going out and doing live performances where they can attract an audience who will then go and buy their music because they've seen them perform, or they will buy merchandise. So really the revenue streams from these technologies for artists themselves is quite minimal. For the music industries, it's a different matter altogether, because the record labels generally tend to take a much bigger percentage. So I think there's a dialectic going on between the consumers and the industry, and this idea of protecting artists' revenue streams and their artists' livelihood through the imposition of a set of copyright laws that are out of date. Technology can be and has proven to be a really good thing for the music industries. The music industries just needs to know how to work with it rather than perhaps having a knee-jerk reaction to it. So if you think of people like Daniel Ek that own Spotify, in the 90s, late 90s, there were a number of people that were working on the idea of music streaming services. And these ideas come about generally from a lack of something. So at that time, people were thinking, well, I want to listen to music on the move, but I don't necessarily want to carry my music around me in a storage device, and I'm limited to the amount of pieces of music I've got on that storage device, whether it be on their phone or a portable hard drive. So the idea was actually I want to be able to access music when I like, where I like, and that was enabled through companies like Spotify, through a number of streaming services that would say to people, well, you can do that through our service, and we would expect you to pay. Some of it's free, which is great, but there are premium services that you can pay for. I think the big problem there was then the music industry was like, well, how do we keep a tab of how many plays there are of Ed Sheeran's latest song, and how do we gain our revenue stream back? So there has been a number of conversations and various lawsuits that have gone through court to try and find ways that these services, which everybody wants, can still maintain a revenue stream for the people that are taking part in them, for some of the performers. So it's about, again, rather than seeing these things as dialectically opposed, it's about the music industry working with tech companies, because tech companies are now the media companies. Google has a massive impact and influence. They own YouTube now. YouTube is one of the premier ways of people accessing music, and it's trying to find ways to work with these companies rather than trying to work against them, or at least trying to imposed laws upon them. So it involves discussion, it involves collaboration. So with the given state of the music industries and technology, there is this question now of, can traditional music survive in an era of technology? Well, if we think about traditional music as roots music or folk music, then I think there's a very strong case that it can, and I would argue that it already does. So if you think of, folk music has always been around. It was a way for people to pass on their traditions and their oral histories. And I think that, folk music or traditional music has been very good at looking at how they can adopt technologies to enable that to happen. So pre-recorded music, pre-1920s, there was a tradition where people would move around from location to location, singing about songs that were pertinent to their particular culture or pertinent to their particular area that they came from. And those songs would document the history of the people that were living at that time. Of course, that was quite limited. Access to that music was limited because you would only hear the people that would come to your village, or you would travel to other villages and hear what other people were performing there. With the advent of recorded music, of course, that music could be recorded and it was easily transportable around the globe. So suddenly traditional music had this massive audience. Music could be recorded, and there were a number of people at the turn of the century that would go around and record folk music and record traditional music to document those histories before they were lost, because of course it was through the oral tradition, and once that oral tradition hadn't been passed on or wasn't being passed on to the next generation, those stories, that part of that culture would be lost. But technology is also very much a two-way thing. If we think about certainly some of the music from Africa or from the Far East or from South America, people have adopted technology as a way of expressing their culture, expressing their music. If we think of people like Youssou N'Dour, Hugh Masekela, there's been a history of people taking technologies such as Western instrumentation, electric instrumentation, and including that in their repertoire of music. So, and of course, with those sort of styles being adopted into their local music, it also opens up a number of new audiences to that music. And of course, there's been a history of Western musicians working with people from other countries in trying to understand and use some of their music in their productions as well. So that technology is developed. I mean, if you think of the internet has enabled people to access music from all around the globe. So it's enabled people to listen to music from small different types of independent styles of music from different areas of the globe, and appreciate that there is a much wider repertoire of music out there. But it's also allowed people to connect not only with the music, but through that music an understanding of that culture, of the politics of that country, the history of that country. So I think the technological side, certainly with traditional music, has it's been one of those things where they've embraced that and they've used it effectively, and sometimes to some really good results. I think there's always going to be some people that would say, well, you're taking away from, by introducing technology, you're taking away from the soul or the heart of that music. But I would argue that actually, as time moves on, we have to move on. We have to accept that technology will happen. It's how that people make use of that, and make use of that in a positive way. So, one of the other things that I'd like to talk about in this is the influence of African music on different music genres. This conference today, this event, is very much focused around the Mbira. It's focused around an instrument that is very traditional in Zimbabwe, but also has some place amongst other African countries as well. And that type of music, again, I think through technology more than anything, has enabled the sounds of Africa to travel. And it's enabled musicians to use some of those rhythms, use some of those styles, and incorporate them into their own music making. I mean, now we have this genre of music. I'm not a big fan of this term, but it's there, world music. What does world music mean? Well, one could argue it's all the types of music that don't fit into a Western traditional popular music style. The typical pop song. that has a form. World music takes on lots of different forms. I'm very mindful of artists like Peter Gabriel, for example, who very much was interested in exploring a number of African rhythms and used that in a lot of his music making, but used those rhythms and combined them with technology such as synthesizers and various forms of electronic musical instrumentation, and brought that music to a whole audience of people. And I think, again, there's been a tradition of Western musicians collaborating with musicians from other parts of the globe. I think certainly with African music, I think its reach has probably been far more significant than we really give it credit for. And sometimes that has been through very positive aspects of how that music has travelled. And unfortunately, sometimes that's happened through some of the more negative aspects. So if we think about African music, again, very much a tradition that's wrapped up in culture and politics, but also very much around its history. And if we look at something like traditional Western music, if we take blues, for example, as a good example of how blues music has now become pretty much standard background to a number of the popular music forms that we see now. I mean, pop songs, for example, there is this tradition of the verse chorus structure to music that very much harkens back to the blues tradition. Now, that music came about through people moving around the globe, taking their music with them. But certainly for the blues music, that came from an oral tradition in Africa. Unfortunately, that was then, the African people were enslaved. That music went with them. It was a way for them to reconnect or to remain connected to their home country. And of course, then with the plantations and slavery, there was a form of music that developed called call and response. That became very wrapped up in what we understand as gospel music. And then that became very wrapped up in the idea of blues music, where blues music became a traditional form of documenting the suffering of the African people in Western nations. And of course, that's now moved on to things like hip hop, which is very firmly rooted in the African American tradition of music making. So that's just one example of how African music has moved across the globe and influenced and impacted on the diaspora of African people, and how they've taken some of those earlier rhythms and incorporated it into their current contemporary lifestyles and used that as a way of documenting their own history and documenting their own culture. So I think it's really important that we recognise the impact that certainly music from Africa has had on Western music tradition. But again, I think it's also a two-way street. I think Western music has had an impact on the way that now contemporary African music is produced. I was recently listening to an artist from the townships of Africa, a guy called Spoke Matembo, who uses traditional South African township rhythms but incorporates it with very Western ideas of music production and music technology, but it's still maintaining that notion of documenting what's going on for the people in the townships in Soweto in South Africa. And despite the fact that there is no longer apartheid, that in fact some of those things still hang on, they still linger on, and people are still feeling very oppressed, or still feeling very disjointed or removed from some of the other areas of African culture where there is a wealthy side to it, and also still people living in abject poverty. So again, African musicians are very mindful of how they are taking Western technologies, or certainly popular music technologies, and incorporating them into their own music making to maintain that history, to maintain that culture and that history and the politics of that country is recognised and carried on to the next generation of Africans and African musicians and the far wider African diaspora.
Thank you.